Hey y'all, I'm Lauren and welcome to Cantina Cast. Today I wanted to talk about a subject more geared towards Star Wars fans that haven't tried reading any of the books before. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to talk about what I recommend doing if you want to take a stab at reading Star Wars and it's something that you've never tried before. I'm just going to kind of give like my own thoughts about what I feel is the most effective way to do this. But I do also want to give a disclaimer that this is something that different people feel differently about. So, like, just because this is the way that I would do it, some people might disagree with me and feel like there's like a better way that worked better for them. But this is just kind of like how I got started and what I felt like worked for me. And I just wanted to share it with y'all. Reading Star Wars can be very daunting. It's something that there's so many different books to choose from. They don't really come out in order, which that's something that we're used to by now as Star Wars fans, but with so many books like we have, and with Legends versus Canon, and with all of these different things, it can be tough to know where to start. So it's totally understandable that even people that have been watching Star Wars for a while, when it comes to the books, they just might not know what to start with and kind of like how to get further into it. Now, I will say that if you followed me on my old channel before I joined Cantina Cast, you've probably heard me talk about this before. On my old channel, I had a video talking about how to read Star Wars, so if you've seen that video before, a lot of this is probably going to be just like kind of like a reiteration of that old video, but I wanted to make a Cantina Cast friendly version because that video seems to have helped a lot of people get started who didn't know how to. So that's why I just wanted to go ahead and make a new version of it. Maybe some parts of it will be a little bit updated. So I want to start off by saying that a lot of times if you Google what Star Wars book should I read first, what usually comes up is the original Legends Thrawn trilogy, the Heir to the Empire trilogy by Timothy Zahn. Timothy Zahn has since then written canon Thrawn books, but you a lot of times hear people saying to start with that Legends Heir to the Empire trilogy. And I don't want you to feel like you have to start with that trilogy if you don't want to. In fact, if it was me and I was starting reading Star Wars now, I wouldn't start with that one. And I'll kind of get into why that is here just in a minute. But I wanted to kind of throw that out there to say that if that trilogy isn't like super speaking to your heart and you don't think you want to start with that one, don't feel pressured to do so. So the reason that I don't recommend starting with that Heir to the Empire trilogy if you're brand new to the Star Wars books is because that trilogy, since Disney acquired Lucasfilm, that trilogy is technically no longer canon. Now, I definitely recommend reading those books at some point. They're great books. There's so much great Legends material out there that I definitely recommend getting to it at some point, but it might be kind of a tricky one to start with if you're getting started now. So let me kind of explain a little bit more what the difference is between canon books and Legends books. Canon means that this story is fact. This is part of the official Star Wars timeline. These are the concrete events that all other canon material is going to be in line with. This is kind of like, think of it as the official version of the events. Legends are all of the novels and comics written before Disney purchased Lucasfilm back in 2012. So what these are is kind of think about it as sort of like an alternate universe version of events. These stories, they don't necessarily have to line up with the canon timeline. Some of them will conflict with canon. That's why I would recommend not starting with Legends if you're brand new to the novels, is because all of that can get a little bit tricky to keep straight if you're just starting out. But even though there's lots of Legends materials out there that's no longer canon, definitely read it at some point. There's some really amazing stories, some really cool interpretations of Star Wars lore, some really awesome characters to get to know. Like, definitely read Legends. Don't count it out. I just think it's not necessarily going to be the best thing to start off with if you're brand new. How to tell the difference between Legends books and canon books is that nowadays when Disney prints Legends books, they have a gold banner at the top that says Legends. Something else that Disney has recently started doing as well is recovering some of the old Legends books, and they're published as part of the Essential Legends collection. So once you feel like you want to start trying Legends, that might be an easy place to start, is like looking at some of the ones that Disney republished, because they seem to be trying to pick some of the more popular ones, some of the ones that have like, I don't know, like kind of stood the test of time as the ones that they're recovering. So those are always like, that might be a good place to check to see if any of those stories interest you. But even though I've said like 500 times now that I don't recommend starting with Legends, there's plenty of people who did start with Legends. I mean, I myself started with Legends. A lot of people prefer Legends over Canon. It just kind of depends on who you talk to. So if you want to start with Legends, that's totally fine. But just because a lot of people who have been Star Wars fans for a long time, just because they did it that way, that doesn't mean that you have to do it that way. I really feel like that's why the Heir to the Empire trilogy is so often recommended as the one that you start with, is because I think it's just because that's the one that a lot of people happened to start with. I don't think there's anything about it that makes it like it has to be the beginning of your Star Wars reading experience, other than it just being a good story that a lot of people just so happened to read first. So that's why when people say, like, this is the Star Wars book that you should start with, take it with a grain of salt, because as all Star Wars fans know, you don't have to do things in any sort of specific order when it comes to enjoying this franchise. But now that we've talked about the difference between canon versus legends, and I've explained why I think it's easier to start with canon, I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about where in canon to start. Because even if you're just narrowing it down to starting with canon, that's still like a huge long list. So you have a few options of where you can start in canon. Some people do like to read in chronological order, meaning they're starting with like the beginning of the Star Wars timeline and they're just going in order year by year all the way up until the sequel trilogies. And if you want to do that, they do in the new Disney canon books. They do keep a timeline in the front of the books to help you keep track of that if that's something that you're interested in. But if you're familiar enough with Star Wars and just kind of like the general layout of things, you don't have to do it chronologically if you don't want to. If you know the difference between the prequel trilogy, the original trilogy, and the sequel trilogy, and you understand the differences between like kind of the general time frame in which those take place, you don't have to read chronologically. You can definitely pick and choose from along the timeline just based on what interests you. To give an example of what I mean is like if you already know automatically that the Clone Wars takes place before A New Hope or something like that, if you at least like have that general kind of knowledge down, then you don't need to stick to things chronologically if you have that sort of a grasp on the Star Wars timeline already. There are some canon books that you want to read in a certain order. Like, for example, there's series of books within canon. Like, there's the Aftermath series, there's the Thrawn series, High Republic series. Anything that's in a series, of course, you want to read those in the order that they're meant to be read in, because it's like a chunk of book that is a series. But if you're reading standalones, meaning it's just one story and it's just kind of like a one and done type of story, then you don't have to feel like you have to stick into this whole chronological parameters if you don't want to. But when you're reading within canon, now that we've established that you don't have to do it chronologically if you don't want to, what I recommend doing, the way that I would recommend tackling it, is think about what eras of Star Wars you really like and what characters you really like, and read books that interest you based on those things. For example, if Qui-Gon is your favorite character, I would recommend looking at what books feature Qui-Gon as a character. Or if Luke is your favorite character, what books feature Luke as a main character. Or if you really love the Clone Wars era, look at what books take place within that time frame. If there's like a certain era that doesn't really sound that interesting to you, like for example, I know that High Republic, there's a lot of people that really, really love High Republic, and there's also a lot of people that feel like High Republic just doesn't really sound that enticing to them. If you're one of those people that doesn't think that High Republic sounds that enticing to you, don't waste your time like reading a bunch of High Republic just to get to the books that come after it. Like, you're just going to torture yourself. don't feel like you have to do that. Just go straight for the eras and the characters that really speak to you the most. And once you start with the ones that interest you the most, that's just going to make your reading experience so much more interesting and fun because you're not like giving yourself a bunch of homework that you have to do. And then once you read the ones that interest you the most, then that might open up doors to other books that you hadn't even thought sounded that interesting before, or maybe then you would want to try another era that you haven't really tried before. So start with the ones that sound exciting to you right off the bat, and then you can always go from there. And that's one of the nice things about how Star Wars was not ever really written in order, is that you can do that if you want and it still works. Eventually the puzzle pieces are going to be put together. And if you feel like you're in a position where you're like, okay, I know that I want to read original trilogy era books, but I don't know what books are in the original trilogy, I would recommend just doing like a simple Google search, as easy as that sounds. There's a lot of fan run websites that will have like an actual database of these Star Wars books that have come out previously. Like they'll have lists of legends, lists of canon books, upcoming books, even. And so just do a search and look at some of those websites, and a lot of these websites are really well put together and they keep track. And so like if you're wanting to read original trilogy, just as an example, just Google original trilogy Star Wars canon books, and you'll get a list that comes up that you can choose from. But if you just want like a quick little rundown of a few books that are good, that might be good ones to start with, I'm going to list off some of my favorites with like a very, very short 1 to 2 sentence summary of what the book is about. And that might kind of give you just like something to start with if you just want a recommendation. Now, these books are not the end all be all. You don't have to start with these. In fact, I encourage you that if you're watching this video and you feel like you've read some other books that would also be good recommendations, put them in the comments, because there's just so many to choose from that these ones that I'm about to list, they're just a few of my favorites. Like there's so many good ones that there's a lot of choices of which ones you want to start with. I'm just going to talk about which ones I love the most. And so I'm going to go through the 5 eras, starting with the High Republic. Now, the High Republic, this is the only era that I would say that you do want to have. These you do want to read in order because these are meant to be a series. If you're interested with the concept of the High Republic, which is meant to be like the golden age of the Jedi, takes place approximately 200 years before the prequels, give or take, depending on which book you're reading. But these ones, the golden age of the Jedi, before the prequels, if that sounds interesting to you, then the one that you would want to start with in the High Republic is Light of the Jedi by Charles Soule. Now, with this particular era, these are meant to be read in a certain order. So that's why I say if High Republic interests you, Light of the Jedi pretty much is going to be your one that I would say to start with, and then you could go forward from there. And now the rest of the ones that I'm going to talk about, they're all standalone, so these ones are not part of a series. So if you're interested in the prequel era, my personal favorite era, I recommend Master and Apprentice by Claudia Gray. This is actually my favorite Star Wars novel. It's been my favorite since it came out. Nothing has unseated it yet, although something might in the future, but this one is just like an all-time great for me. But this story follows Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, and it deals a lot with the prophecy of the Chosen One, which is a really cool part of this book, and it gets really into the dynamic between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon as well. So if you love those characters, if you love prequel era, that's pretty much going to be a must read. And Claudia Gray is just a fantastic writer. She's definitely one of my favorite Star Wars writers. My next recommendation is going to be if you love that era of Rogue One, or the era that Andor takes place in, where it's the rebellion just getting started and you're seeing kind of like the more chaotic, darker side of the rebellion, I recommend Rebel Rising by Beth Revis. It does a great job of following how the rebellion gets started. It's very similar to Andor in that way. So like if you love Andor, I would say this book is pretty much a must read for you. Similar to what we're seeing in Andor, very, very similar themes from Jen Erso's perspective. Next, if the original trilogy is your favorite era of Star Wars and you want to read something from that time, I recommend reading Lost Stars, also by Claudia Gray. I mean, you can see in this list, you can see that she's one of my favorites because I have 2 recs from her on here. But with this book, something that's kind of unique about it that we don't see a ton with canon novels is that the 2 main characters, Sienna and Thane, they are not film characters. So like they're brand new characters created by Claudia Gray, which before the High Republic, that was something that we didn't get a ton of, is just brand new characters in novels. And just in a quick summary of it is that these 2 are childhood best friends. They go to the Imperial Academy. As they are going through their studies, they get closer and closer. Eventually they fall in love, but they are torn apart by the rebellion because eventually um as the empire gets worse and worse and they're learning the realities of that, that's something that the 2 of them have to figure out. And so even though like the love story aspect of this is written so well by Claudia Gray, something else that's really interesting about this story too is thinking about how a lot of the soldiers that were in the empire started off as like normal people, and they had to come to terms with what the empire was doing and kind of decide what they were going to do in response to that, if anything. And so this book is dealing with that a lot as well. So that's a really cool theme to kind of explore more, which is why I recommend this one. And if you love the sequel era and you want to read more from that time frame, I would recommend reading Shadow of the Sith by Adam Christopher. This book, it does a really great job of tying the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy together, and it does address like some of the things that a lot of us wish that the sequel trilogy would have explained more or gotten more into or spent a little bit more time on. This book does a really good job of doing that. So like even if you were disappointed in some aspects of the sequel trilogy, this book is a great one to read because it explained some things for me that I know that I was wanting. That's one reason this book is great, but even aside from that, it's so much more than that. Like the writing is so great, the characterization of Luke is great. We're seeing Luke kind of like he's older at this point, so this is like several years after Return of the Jedi. It's just a really great story and really great exploration of Luke and Lando, characters that we've known for so long, but getting to know them a little bit more, if you can imagine that. Another book that does a really good job of that as well is Bloodline, also by Claudia Gray. Basically just read all of Claudia Gray's books is what I'm saying, apparently. But Bloodline also does a really good job of tying the original trilogy and the sequel trilogy together, and it does that rather than using a story centered around Luke, it's a story centered around Leia. So that's another one that if you're interested in that time frame and a book that will do that for you, that's another good one to look at. That one also gets more into like why the New Republic was so ineffective and kind of like exploring the politics of that. So that's kind of a cool thing to dive into as well. So yes, that's how I recommend tackling getting started reading Star Wars. Those are some of my own favorites that if any of those sound interesting to you, those are some options for ones you could start with. But yeah, like don't be afraid to just kind of like explore what books sound cool to you and just jumping right in, because it looks intimidating because there's so many covering so many characters and so many time frames. But if you just kind of jump into it and just get started, then it gets easier to like figure out where you want to go next. And also, as I mentioned earlier, if you have read Star Wars books before and you feel like you want to add some recommendations that you think would be great for first time readers, maybe ones that I didn't mention, let me know in the comments what you think. And so that way, anyone who might be trying to pick something, maybe they have some more stuff to pick from. And I'm always posting reviews and sneak peeks here on the Cantina Cast YouTube channel as well. So following those is another way to get some more recommendations and to kind of stay up to date with what's currently coming out too. And I post whenever I have like an upcoming video or there's a book that I'm getting ready to cover. I always post it on my Instagram as well, which is Lauren Covers Star Wars, which is just all one word. So that's another place that you can go if you want to see what's coming up as well. But thanks so much for watching, guys, and I hope that y'all have a great rest of your day. Bye, y'all.